Dayton, Ohio, the 1980s. A room full of the most dangerous men in the state. Drug dealers, kingpins, operators who had built their empires through violence and territory and the specific ruthlessness that the crack era demanded from the men who wanted to survive it. These were not soft men. These were men who had seen everything, done everything, men whose names made other men uncomfortable just by being spoken in a room. And every single one of them was afraid of one person. Not the government, not a rival organization, not a crew from New York or Chicago or Los Angeles coming to take what they had built. One man from Dayton. When he walked into a room, the energy changed. Not because he announced himself, not because he came with an entourage or made noise, or put on a performance of power that men in his position sometimes perform. Because of what everybody in that room already knew. This man controlled pricing across the entire state of Ohio. He had the final say on who could make money and who couldn't. Out-of-towners who came to Ohio thinking they could operate without his blessing were made examples of. The kind of examples that nobody in the state needed to see twice to understand the message. You asked him for permission, or you didn't operate. The kingpins in that room, men who made other men tuck their chains and lower their voices, lowered their own voices when this man walked in. His name was Stuart Norman. The streets of Ohio called him Bugs. The state called him something else, Mr. Ohio. And this is how a man from Dayton made the most feared people in Ohio afraid of him. Bugs Norman did not inherit Ohio. He built it from the ground up, in a state that nobody was watching, in a geography that the major drug organizations on the East Coast and the West Coast overlooked because they were focused on the cities that mattered to them: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami. Ohio was between all of them, which meant Ohio was open. Bugs Norman saw what nobody else saw: a state with no dominant organization, no entrenched power structure that would require years of violence to displace. A market that was being served inconsistently by operators who came in from outside, took what they could, and left without building anything permanent. He built something permanent. He established a distribution network that covered the entire state. Not one city, not one corridor, Ohio. The pricing that every dealer in the state paid for their supply, he set. The territories that operators ran, he approved. The out-of-towners who periodically came to Ohio with their New York product and their New York attitude, thinking they could operate the way they operated back home, found out immediately what Ohio was. Bugs Norman's state. The composure that made him most dangerous was not the kind you perform. It was the kind that comes from a man who has calculated every possible scenario and found them all manageable. His associates, men who had been in the most violent and high-pressure situations the drug trade produces, said the same thing about him consistently. They never saw him break a sweat. Not once. Not when law enforcement was circling. Not when rivals were making moves. Not when the specific anxieties that running a statewide operation generate were pressing in from every direction simultaneously. Calm, cool, collected. He was described as the elephant in the room, not because he was loud, not because he made threats or raised his voice or performed the specific theater of dangerous men who need to remind rooms who they are. Because he was inevitable. His presence was felt before he arrived and after he left. The specific gravity of a man who has built something so significant that his name carries weight in spaces he never enters. Kingpins who made other men tuck their own chains around Bugs Norman. The lifestyle matched the power. Presidential Rolexes, $100,000 watches that he would take off his own wrist mid-conversation and hand to a close associate as a gift. Because money was the last of his problems. The specific generosity of a man whose supply of money has exceeded his ability to spend it, who gives because giving costs nothing. He traveled to Sierra Leone in West Africa. He invested in a gold mine. He began wearing raw diamonds, sourced directly from his own mine, in his chains and his watches. This was a kingpin from Dayton, Ohio, with his own gold mine in Africa providing his jewelry. That is not a man who is operating on a local level, front row seats at Mike Tyson fights, a $200,000 Ferrari, a custom-built drag racing car he called the War Wagon. He gave his teenage son a Jaguar, not as a birthday gift, not as a special occasion, but as a Tuesday. He owned car washes, luxury apartments in New York and in Florida, multiple properties across multiple states, generating legitimate-looking income that still could not explain the $50,000 to $80,000 in cash that his associates said was just lying around his apartments, not locked away, not hidden, just there, on tables and counters. The casual relationship with cash that develops when it arrives faster than it can be organized. He told people he was a professional gambler. The IRS looked at the Ferrari and the gold mine and the War Wagon and the Jaguar he gave his son on a Tuesday. They disagreed. The IRS was the beginning of the end. When the government cannot find the crime, they find the money. They look at the lifestyle and they look at the reported income, and they build the case around the gap between those two numbers. That gap tells a story that courtrooms understand clearly even when the specific details of how the money was made are difficult to prove. Bugs Norman's gap was significant. Federal investigators moved in, building the case, following the money through the car washes, the apartments, the War Wagon, and the raw diamond chains from the Sierra Leone mine. And then the inside opened up. His nephew. The specific devastation that organized crime produces when it involves family, when a man brings his own blood into what he has built, because blood is supposed to be the one thing that holds when everything else is being pulled apart. His nephew was not built for what Bugs Norman had built. When law enforcement came with their offer, the specific arithmetic of cooperation that prosecutors use to dismantle organizations was laid out. The nephew took it. He gave up everything. Prosecutors seized it all. The car washes, the apartments in New York and Florida, the War Wagon, the Ferrari, the watches, the raw diamond chains that had come from his own gold mine in Africa. $2.6 million in cash. The entire physical record of what Bugs Norman had built across the state of Ohio reduced to evidence tags and asset forfeiture documents. He did his time like a man. No complaints, no public blame for the nephew, no attempt to rewrite what he was in a way that made himself smaller or the betrayal easier to process. He accepted what had happened with the same composure that his associates said they had never seen break in all the years they had known him. He did his time. Stuart Bugs. Norman passed away in 2011, the man who made Ohio's most dangerous men afraid, who set the pricing and the rules for an entire state, who sourced his diamonds from his own mine in Africa, who gave his teenage son a Jaguar on a Tuesday, who walked into rooms full of kingpins and made the energy change without saying a word, who went down because his nephew was not built for what he had built. Mr. Ohio. Now we are going to the second story. Marcy Projects, Brooklyn, the 1980s. A man is walking through the block. He is not the loudest man in the room. He is not wearing the most jewelry. He is not driving the flashiest car or making the most noise or announcing himself the way that men in that era often announce themselves, through spectacle, through visibility, through the specific performance of power that the crack era demanded from the men who had it. He is just walking. But something happens when he turns onto the strip. The men who were standing there, the men with the rope chains and the money and the specific confidence of people who have built something real in one of Brooklyn's most dangerous housing projects, they tuck their chains. Not because he asked them to, not because he threatened them, because when you see this man coming, you understand without being told that wearing your jewelry in front of him is a decision you will regret. He made real gangsters tuck their chains. He made hustlers from other boroughs stay far away from Brooklyn. He made the names that your favorite documentaries celebrate become food on Rikers Island. His name was Big Unique. And years after he walked these blocks, the producers of one of the most watched television shows in America looked at what he was and decided that the world needed to see it, not with his name, with a character that captured the specific energy of what Big Unique was. The aura, the attitude, the specific top of the world feeling that a man carries when he moves through a neighborhood that understands what he is without a single word being spoken. This is the story of the general of Marcy Projects, the man the cameras never found, but television couldn't resist. Marcy houses, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. 27 six-story buildings spread across 28 acres near Flushing Avenue and Nostrand Avenue. 1,705 apartments. A public housing complex that opened in 1949 and became one of the most recognizable addresses in American hip-hop history. Jay-Z grew up in Marcy. Sean Carter, the boy who would become the biggest rapper in the world, grew up in the same buildings, on the same blocks, in the same specific geography that Big Unique was navigating in the 1980s. That context matters. Because Marcy in the 1980s was not just a housing project, it was a world with its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own specific currency of respect that operated independently of anything happening outside its borders. You couldn't just walk through Marcy, you had to be known. And being known meant one of two things. Either you were getting money, building the kind of operation that the crack era made possible for young men who understood supply and demand before they understood long division, or you were taking it. Big Unique was in the taking business. He ran through Marcy and Tompkins, the two projects that shared the same school, whose young men moved through the same corridors, whose hierarchies overlapped in the specific way that adjacent housing projects overlap in Brooklyn. He ran with K-Sun. If you knew what K-Sun was into, and the streets of Brooklyn knew exactly what K-Sun was into, then you knew without being told what Big Unique was into. Both men rocking rope chains, both men dressed to impress. Not as vanity, as strategy. If you look like money, dealers don't clock you as a threat. They think you're part of the same system. By the time they realized Big Unique was not part of the same system, it was too late. The stick-up game in 1980s, Brooklyn was its own specific profession, not robbery in the way that the legitimate world understands robbery, not opportunistic, not random, strategic. The stick-up kids studied their targets the way that legitimate businessmen study their markets. They understood who had money and who didn't, who was protected and who had let their guard down, who wore their wealth visibly and who kept it hidden, who moved alone and who moved with backup. Big Unique was moving through all of that. The crack era created a specific opportunity for stick-up kids that had not existed before. The money was everywhere. Young men who were 16 and 17 years old were generating thousands of dollars per day. Operations that would have been considered significant in the heroin era were now being run by teenagers in housing projects who had never managed anything more complex than their own household. And with that money came the visibility that money always produces. The rope chains, the Cazals, the Walkmans and the bubble goose jackets, and the specific uniform of Marcy Projects prosperity in the 1980s. All of it visible, all of it announcing wealth to anyone paying attention. Big Unique was always paying attention. He and his crew had what the transcript describes with specific reverence: a treasure chest full of guns, 38 revolvers, 3 57s, 44 long nose, every day a different pistol, not for show, not for the specific aesthetic of a man who wants to be seen as armed. Because in the work they were doing, the specific commerce of taking from the men who had, the gun was the business tool, the instrument through which the transaction was conducted, and Big Unique was always ready. Tracksuit or slacks, it did not matter what he was wearing, he was busting his gun. In South Jamaica, Queens, and the Bronx, the names that hip-hop would eventually celebrate were building operations. In Marcy Projects, Brooklyn, Big Unique was dismantling them. The men your favorite documentaries romanticize about, the Kingpins and the operators who generated hundreds of thousands of dollars through the crack economy, became food on Rikers Island when they crossed paths with Big Unique and men like him. That is not street exaggeration. That is the specific economic reality of what stick-up kids did to the drug trade. Every empire required inputs, product, cash flow, the specific liquidity that allowed operations to keep moving. The stick-up kids provided an alternative extraction mechanism. They did not need to build supply chains or manage workers or navigate the specific organizational complexity of running a drug operation. They just needed to identify who had what and take it. Big Unique developed something in the process that most stick-up kids never achieved: love. Most stick-up kids are hated. The men they rob hate them. The men connected to the men they rob hate them. The entire organizational ecosystem of the drug trade generates permanent enemies for anyone who takes from it. Big Unique developed love from many, not universal love. The handful who hated him were met with beatdowns and gunplay. He could have it that way too. That was also part of the game. But the love, the genuine respect that the younger generation in Marcy had for him was real. He was not just a predator in their neighborhood, he was a figure. He let younger men rock his chain to school. He moved through the block with the specific generosity of a man who understood that reputation is built through relationships as much as through fear. He was respected in Marcy, in Tompkins, in other projects. This was back when you could not have a stain on your name, when anything questionable about you got addressed fast, when the streets were running quality control on every man who claimed to be something. Big Unique passed every inspection. His name traveled fast. Cats had his name in their mouths without even knowing what he looked like. That is the specific power of a reputation built on results rather than visibility. Most men in that era needed to be seen to be known. Big Unique was known before he was seen. His name moved through Brooklyn and into other boroughs the way that all genuine reputations move, through the specific oral history of men who have witnessed something and cannot stop talking about it. By the time someone from another borough first laid eyes on him, they already knew what he was, and they already understood that whatever they were wearing that day was a decision they might regret. There is a specific detail about Big Unique that the transcript preserves that tells you more about what he was than any description of a robbery or a fight. When he came around, people lowered their voices. Not silence, not the specific silence of fear that makes a room go cold when danger enters, just lower. The specific self-awareness of people who understand that certain conversations should not be had in front of certain people, who instinctively adjust their behavior in the presence of a man whose capacities they understand and respect. And the chains, real gangsters, the men who had built genuine reputations in Marcy and the surrounding Brooklyn projects, the men whose names carried weight of their own, tucked their chains when Big Unique came around. Think about what that means. These were not soft men. These were not men who were easily intimidated or who performed fear for social reasons. These were men who had built their own reputations through their own work, and they tucked their chains. Because wearing your jewelry in front of Big Unique was a decision, and the calculation of that decision, what happens if this man decides that chain belongs to him, was a calculation that always resolved in the same direction. Tuck it! Hustlers from other boroughs stayed far away from Brooklyn because of men like him. That geography of fear, not just his block, not just his projects, but entire boroughs calculating the risk of coming to Brooklyn, is the specific measure of what Big Unique's reputation had built. He made Brooklyn feel like a place that required permission to enter. Union Square, Lower Manhattan, the park on 14th Street, where New York's various worlds intersected. Music, fashion, the street economy, the legitimate world, all of it occupying the same geography simultaneously. Big Unique was known there, not known the way celebrities are known, not recognized because his face had been seen on television or his voice had been heard on radio. Known the way that certain men are known in New York City's underground through the oral history of what they have done and what they are capable of doing. He made a name for himself in Union Square, knocking dudes completely out. The gunslingers knew how to knuckle in that era. Unlike the era that followed, where the fist became a secondary option behind the firearm, men like Big Unique understood that there was a specific kind of respect available to a man who could handle himself with his hands before reaching for the hardware. He would pass his partner the gun just to rumble. That choice, giving away the weapon to fight with his hands, is the specific detail that tells you the kind of confidence Big Unique operated with. He wasn't using the gun as a substitute for courage. He was using his hands because he wanted to. The case came. Big Unique was sent up to Rikers Island, New York City's main jail complex, the island in the East River where the city processed its most serious cases and where the men waiting for trial or serving shorter sentences were held. Rikers in the 1980s was its own world with its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own specific currency of respect that was separate from anything happening on the streets but deeply connected to it. Because the men on Rikers were the same men from the streets. Every housing project, every borough, every operation and every reputation that had been built across New York City's underground economy was represented in Rikers' population. And in that world, the young man from Marcy Projects was a young man. By any measure, Big Unique was younger than most of the men he was competing with for respect on Rikers. He didn't let that stop him. He went hard in the recce yard. The recreation yard, the specific geography of Rikers Island, where reputations were built and tested and confirmed or denied in the specific physical language that prison respects above all other languages. He put in work, and he earned something on Rikers that his street reputation alone couldn't have given him: the respect of the real original gangsters, the men who had been in the game since before Big Unique was in the streets, the men whose tenures predated the crack era, who had built and lost and rebuilt through the heroin era and all the eras that came before. Those men saw what Big Unique was, and they gave him their respect, not because he asked for it, because he earned it. When he got out, he stepped in places people couldn't go. His name was good everywhere. When Big Unique came home from Rikers, something specific happened in Marcy Projects. The men who had been out while he was inside, men who had been moving through the block with the specific freedom that comes when a certain kind of presence is removed, went back in. Not literally arrested necessarily, back inside their apartments, back inside their spaces, back inside the specific geography that safe men occupy when a dangerous man returns to the neighborhood. He came home from the bed, and he needed everything. It was over. He was taking whatever he wanted, making men strip like go-go dancers. The hunger of a man who has been locked up and comes home to a neighborhood that has been generating money in his absence and who has the specific capacity to take his share of that generation regardless of who had been building it while he was gone. He was back like he never left. The television show Power launched in 2014, created by Courtney Kemp, produced by 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson, the South Jamaica Queens rapper who had grown up hearing the legends of men like Big Unique when those legends traveled from Brooklyn to Queens through the specific oral history of New York's underground. Power became one of the most watched cable television series in American history. Its prequel, Raising Kanan, set in the 1990s in South Jamaica, Queens, followed the origin story of one of Power's most beloved characters, Kanan Stark. The character that Power and Raising Kanan built, the energy, the attitude, the specific aura of a young man who walks through dangerous neighborhoods with the top-of-the-world feeling, who wears truck jewelry and nugget bracelets and moves through spaces that most people would not dare enter with a specific comfort that announces exactly what he is. The cars, the attitude, the comfort in places most people would not dare to visit. The members, only account said it directly. Big Unique's style and charisma were featured in Power and Raising Kanan. The character gives us the aura of the dope boys of that era. The men who created Raising Kanan looked at what the crack era produced in New York's housing projects. The specific energy of a man like Big Unique moving through Marcy and Tompkins with a treasure chest full of guns and the love of the younger generation and the fear of every borough that thought about coming to Brooklyn, and they built a character that millions of people watched without knowing the real man the energy came from. Over the years, things slowed down, the way things always slow down for men who built what Big Unique built in the crack era. K-Sun was gone, Tuck was gone behind bars. A lot of guys fell victim to the game, whether behind bars or in the grave. The men who had shared his era, who had rocked rope chains and navigated Marcy and Tompkins with him through the wildest years that Brooklyn produced, were gone, locked up or dead. Big Unique outlasted them. He adjusted. He accepted that the glory days were over. By the 2000s, the era that had produced him had given way to a different Brooklyn, a different drug economy, a different generation of young men who were navigating the same housing projects with different rules, different weapons, different codes. The nugget bracelets and 4 finger rings and rope chains that had defined the 1980s were giving way to something different. The men who wore them, the men who had built their reputations in the specific physical and psychological language of crack-era Brooklyn, were either gone or adjusting. Big Unique was adjusting. But here is what never adjusted: the respect. The specific recognition that men who knew what he was still gave him when he moved through the neighborhood, that remained. That does not expire. In the world that Big Unique had come from, respect was not a renewable resource. It was a permanent one, earned through specific actions at specific moments in a specific era. He had earned it, and it followed him into the 2000s and beyond. Because in Marcy Projects, in the specific oral history that Brooklyn preserves about its own legends, what a man was in his prime is what he remains forever. May 11th, 2013. The corner of Marcus Garvey. Big Unique died in a motorcycle accident, not shot, not arrested, not consumed by the specific violence that had taken K-Sun and Tuck and so many of the men he had navigated the crack era with. A motorcycle accident on a corner in Brooklyn. The man who had made real gangsters tuck their chains, who had built a reputation that made hustlers from other boroughs stay far away from Brooklyn, who had gone hard in the recce yard on Rikers and earned the respect of OGs who had been in the game before he was born, who had outlasted every legend of his era, gone at a corner in Brooklyn. The streets gathered to mourn him the way that streets mourn the men who genuinely shaped them, not with the specific fanfare of celebrities or public figures, with the quiet, private, deeply felt recognition that something real had left the world. Most stick-up kids died young or went to prison for decades. Very few made it out at all. Big Unique set his mark. He ran his movie. He will never be forgotten. Not in Marcy Projects, not in Tompkins, not in every borough that understood what it meant when his name was mentioned, and not on the television screens where millions of people watched a character built on his energy without ever knowing the man whose aura they were actually watching. Big Unique, the general of Marcy Projects, the man that power never named. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. Baltimore, 1981. A car turns onto a street in East Baltimore. The people on the block stop what they're doing, not because they recognize the driver, because they have never seen a car like this before. Gull-wing doors, brushed stainless steel body, a machine that looks like it came from a different decade entirely. The man behind the wheel is not from Hollywood, not from Wall Street, not from anywhere outside these few square miles of East Baltimore where he grew up. He lives here. He just moves differently. In a room somewhere in this city, it is raining indoors. Not a leak, not an accident, by design. In another building, a boardroom. Computers tracking numbers that most people in this neighborhood will never see in a lifetime. In Las Vegas, a ringside seat at a Sugar Ray Leonard fight, purchased without checking the price. In Beverly Hills, an $1,800 silk dress, bought for a woman, without hesitation. And on these streets, a product so pure that dealers were driving in from Washington, D.C. and Virginia just to get their hands on it. One man, one city, $50 million per year. And HBO spent years telling his story to the entire world. They just never used his real name. His name was Maurice King. The streets of Baltimore called him one thing, Peanut King. And everything you just heard, the car, the rain room, the boardroom, the $50 million, the HBO show built on his life, is only the beginning of his story. Baltimore, Maryland. Before The Wire made it famous, before the HBO cameras captured the specific geography of the towers and the corners and the police department that couldn't contain what was happening in the streets, Baltimore was already one of the most consequential drug markets in the eastern United States. Not because of its size. Baltimore is not New York, not Chicago, not Los Angeles. Baltimore is a mid-sized port city of 600,000 people sitting between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia on the I-95 corridor. A city that produced Edgar Allan Poe and Billie Holiday and Thurgood Marshall. A city of neighborhoods so distinct and so insular that people from one part of town sometimes spent their entire lives without crossing into another. A black city. Chocolate City in its own right. A city where the Great Migration had brought black families from the Deep South through multiple generations, building communities, building institutions, building the specific social fabric that made Baltimore different from every other city on the East Coast. And a city with a heroin problem that predated the crack era by decades. The China White and the Mexican mud that flowed through New York's French Connection pipeline had been finding its way to Baltimore since the 1950s and 60s. By the time Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1973, the White House estimated 10 tons of heroin crossed American borders every year. A significant portion of it ended up in Baltimore. State health officials estimated heroin reached 20,000 Marylanders in that era. Not just junkies, GIs returning from Vietnam, businessmen who called themselves chippers, high school students who started at parties and couldn't stop. The black market that served that demand was enormous, $900 million. That is what Baltimore's heroin market was worth annually in the early 1980s, $900 million in a city of 600,000 people. That is 3 times what the entire city of Baltimore spent on its public schools. 3 times. Federal prosecutors had been attacking Baltimore's drug infrastructure for years before Peanut King. A succession of big names had been locked up. John Liddy Jones, Bernard Big Head Brother Lee, and Little Melvin Williams, who ran his operation on the West Side with the specific quiet power that made him Baltimore's most enduring street figure. Each arrest was celebrated by law enforcement as a turning point. Each arrest was followed by someone else filling the vacuum. Because the $900 million market didn't disappear when a kingpin went to prison. It just changed management. And in East Baltimore, the management was Maurice King. Maurice Peanut King grew up in the same East Baltimore streets he would eventually control. The specific origin story of how he moved from the neighborhood into the drug trade, how a young black man from Charm City became the lord of the city's entire heroin economy, is the kind of story that the streets preserve in oral history rather than court documents. What is documented is what he built. And what he built started with a foundation of absolute product quality. Every other dealer in Baltimore in the late 1970s was putting out 3% pure heroin. 3%. That is the standard of the era. Cut, stretched, diluted with whatever was available to maximize the dealer's margin while giving the customer barely enough to feel the effect. 3% was what Baltimore expected. Peanut King put out 7 to 10% pure. In an industry where 3% was the norm, 7 to 10% was extraordinary. Not just better than the competition, more than twice as good as anything else on the market. The effect on his customer base was immediate and absolute. Word traveled the way word travels in cities that run on the underground economy, through the specific networks of people who know what is available and where the best product is and who is moving it. Dealers came from across Baltimore, then they came from beyond Baltimore. Washington, D.C., 40 miles south on Interstate 95. Dealers from D.C., who had heard about the purity coming out of East Baltimore, were making the drive specifically to buy from Peanut King. Virginia, Pennsylvania, cities across the East Coast, all of them making the trip to Baltimore because the best heroin in America in 1980 was being distributed by one man in East Baltimore. That specific quality advantage gave Peanut King something that most operators in the drug trade never achieve: the ability to name his price. When you have the best product and everyone knows it, you don't compete on price. You set the price, and everyone pays it. Because the alternative is going back to 3% purity from someone else. And once you've had what Peanut King was selling, going back feels like going backward. He built on that foundation methodically. His territory stretched from Cherry Hill across the Hanover Street Bridge all the way to Streeper Street in southeast Baltimore. Not one corner, not one block. A geography of East Baltimore that encompassed dozens of streets and hundreds of corners, all of it under his organizational control. His partner in all of this was Thomas Ricks. The streets called him Joe Dancer. Where Peanut King was the CEO, the face, the brand, the man whose style set the standard for what Baltimore wanted to be, Joe Dancer was the enforcer, the man who handled the situations that required a different kind of handling, the man who made sure that the organizational discipline Peanut King had built was maintained by everyone inside it. Together, they ran something that East Baltimore had never seen before: $50 million per year. Let that number breathe for a moment. $50 million flowing through one man's organization in one city in 1 year. In the early 1980s, when $50 million was worth significantly more than it is today. That kind of money required infrastructure that most people associate with legitimate corporations rather than drug organizations. And Peanut King built exactly that: an executive boardroom. In the early 1980s, when personal computers were brand new technology that most American businesses were still figuring out how to use, Peanut King had computers in his boardroom tracking every dollar moving through his operation. Not a ledger, not a notebook. Computers, the same technology that Wall Street was implementing to track financial transactions. Maurice King was using it to run the most sophisticated drug distribution operation in Baltimore history. At North Avenue and Chester Street, he built a facility that Baltimore's top narcotics detective, Captain Joe Newman, described in words that stopped the courtroom cold: a fully mirrored gymnasium, 2 universal workout systems, punching bags, a whirlpool, and a room where Peanut King could control the weather. He could make it rain inside, something the captain called jungle mist, inside a building in East Baltimore. Not a metaphor, not street exaggeration, a room with environmental control sophisticated enough to simulate rainfall and tropical humidity, inside a structure built by a drug dealer in the middle of a Baltimore winter. His house in Silver Spring, Maryland, had no windows. Not one. Just surveillance cameras covering every exterior angle of the building, every approach, every blind spot that a rival or a law enforcement surveillance team might use. He was not taking chances with his security. And then the DeLorean, the car that no one in Baltimore had ever seen before he pulled up in it. Designed by John DeLorean, the General Motors executive who built a car company on his own reputation and audacity, the DMC-12 was everything that standard American cars of the early 1980s were not. Brushed stainless steel exterior, gull-wing doors that opened upward instead of outward, a rear-mounted engine, the specific visual language of the future, of Back to the Future, of science fiction, of a world that had not arrived yet. Peanut King drove one through East Baltimore every day. He brought that exotic life into Baltimore's street culture the way certain figures bring specific things into specific places, through the force of personality and the specific credibility that comes from being the man everyone in the city answers to. Men across Baltimore started copying everything he did. The bedroom slippers, $150 a pair. Men who had never paid that much for footwear in their lives started buying them because Peanut King wore them. The diamond pinky rings, $40,000 each, according to Peanut King himself. Men across Baltimore wanted rings that looked like his. The bejeweled Zippo lighter that he smoked with. A detail so specific and so carefully curated that it became part of the visual identity of what Peanut King was in Baltimore. He was not just a drug lord, he was a brand, and the brand extended beyond the streets. He donated to charities. He sponsored youth basketball teams in the same neighborhoods where his product was feeding addiction. He sat enthroned for photographs at Odell's nightclub, the famous Baltimore venue where the city's underground elite gathered, slim and sharp as a knife, surrounded by people who understood exactly what he represented. He thought nothing of flying to Las Vegas to watch a Sugar Ray Leonard fight. Nothing of strolling Beverly Hills and buying a woman an $1,800 silk dress without checking the price. He laundered his money through Atlantic City casinos. He reinvested in stocks. He invested in real estate. Peanut King was not a man who spent everything he made. He was building. Detective Sergeant Gary Childs made a decision that would define the next 3 years of his career. He got in a camper, parked in East Baltimore, and watched. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. Documenting the specific patterns of how Peanut King's organization moved. Who came to whom? When deliveries happened. Where money moved. The specific organizational rhythm of a $50 million per year operation that had been running in plain sight for years because nobody had been patient enough to build the case from the ground up. Childs was patient enough. The FBI was building its own parallel case. Together they assembled the evidence that would eventually be presented at trial, not just the product and the cash, but the organizational architecture of what Peanut King had built. The computers, the boardroom, the specific management structure that made his operation function like a corporation rather than a street gang. In 1982, they moved. The news went out across Baltimore television. An FBI warrant was issued for the arrest of Maurice Peanut King, one of the biggest kingpins of the heroin trade in Baltimore history. When agents executed the search, what they found confirmed everything they had documented from the camper. 4 pounds of pure heroin, $300,000 in cash. The biggest drug bust in Baltimore City history. Peanut King was arrested. Joe Dancer was arrested. Their entire organization was exposed to the full weight of a federal prosecution that had been building for years. The trial lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of testimony, 5 weeks of evidence, 5 weeks of the federal government laying out in precise detail exactly what Maurice King had built in East Baltimore and exactly how many lives it had touched, and exactly what the cost of that operation had been to the neighborhoods it ran through. The jury convicted Peanut King and Joe Dancer on the CCE 848 charge, the continuing criminal enterprise statute, the Kingpin charge, the most serious federal drug charge in American law. The charge specifically designed for the men at the very top of drug organizations, the men who organized, supervised, and managed 5 or more people in drug trafficking. Before sentencing, Peanut King stood before the federal judge. He spoke, "Don't take my life away." The judge looked at this man in the bedroom slippers and the diamond rings who had driven a DeLorean through East Baltimore while feeding addiction to 20,000 Marylanders, who had built computers and boardrooms and jungle mist rooms while the neighborhoods he operated in deteriorated under the weight of what he was selling. The judge said 7 words that Maurice King has carried for 40 years. You were dealing in human misery. 50 years in federal prison, his diamond rings confiscated, his necklaces, his furs, all sold at public auction at a fraction of their original value by people who had no idea whose fingers those rings had been on. The DeLorean, gone. The computers, gone. The boardroom, gone. The room where it rained inside, gone. Everything Maurice King had built, reduced to evidence tags and auction lots. 5 years into a 50-year sentence, Peanut King is inside, thinking about the outside, not just thinking. Federal agents monitoring prison communications picked up something extraordinary on a payphone inside the federal facility where Peanut King was serving his sentence. His voice, speaking in code, arranging a heroin deal from inside federal prison. $750,000. He had been inside for 5 years. He had received a 50-year sentence. He was supposed to be finished, cut off from the operation, cut off from the money, cut off from the specific world he had built through his entire adult life. And he was on a prison payphone arranging a $750,000 heroin transaction. The additional charges added to his sentence. The government that had already given him 50 years gave him more. Because some men don't stop. Because the organizational intelligence that builds a $50 million per year operation doesn't go dormant just because the man is locked up. Because Peanut King, even inside federal prison, was still Peanut King. After Peanut King's arrest, something happened in East Baltimore that the federal prosecutors who celebrated the bust never fully anticipated. East Baltimore descended into chaos, not the productive chaos of a market reorganizing around new management. The destructive chaos of a power vacuum where every crew and every operator in the geography that Peanut King had controlled began fighting for their share of a market that had been organized under one man's discipline. Disputes that Peanut King would have resolved became shootings. Territorial conflicts that his organizational structure had managed became wars. The $900 million Baltimore heroin market that had operated with the specific efficiency of a corporation under one man's management became a war zone the moment that man was removed from it. Academic historians who studied the Baltimore drug war documented what the police were celebrating as a victory from a different angle. The takedowns did not put a dent in Baltimore's $900 million heroin market. After Peanut King's territory in East Baltimore opened, it descended into competitive chaos. The government had eliminated the Kingpin. The market had survived. The violence had increased. The same paradox that would eventually make The Wire such devastating television, that removing individual operators doesn't eliminate the conditions that produce them, played out in East Baltimore in real time after Maurice King went to prison. And nobody made a documentary about it. Nobody wrote a book about it. It just happened. While Peanut King sat in a federal facility serving a sentence that would last nearly 4 decades. 2 decades after Peanut King's arrest, David Simon sat down to write a television series about Baltimore. He had spent years as a Baltimore Sun crime reporter. He had written The Corner, a book about a West Baltimore family consumed by the drug trade. He had seen from the inside what the drug economy did to neighborhoods and families, and the specific human beings caught inside it. He wanted to tell that story on television. He needed characters, and the characters he built, the characters that would make The Wire the most acclaimed television drama in American history, drew directly from the men who had shaped Baltimore's drug trade. Avon Barksdale, the organizational genius, the man who ran the towers. He sat at the top of a management structure so sophisticated that law enforcement struggled to understand it. He had a boardroom mentality applied to the street. He maintained discipline across a complex operation through the force of his personality and the specific respect his name commanded. Stringer Bell, the business mind, the man who wanted to take the drug trade corporate. He read economics textbooks and attended community college classes and dreamed of taking the money generated on the corners and investing it in legitimate enterprise. The organizational sophistication of the Barksdale organization, the computers and the management structure, the specific personality of a man who was simultaneously a street figure and a CEO, all came together in those characters. Seth Ferranti, the true crime writer whose guerrilla convict publishing house became the definitive source on American drug history, said it directly. The characters in The Wire were based off his persona and exploits. His name was Maurice Peanut King. Every person who has ever watched The Wire, every person who has argued about whether Avon or Stringer was the better character, every person who has quoted Omar Little or McNulty or Bunk, every person who has told someone the show is the greatest television drama ever made, has been watching a story built on the life of a man from East Baltimore who drove a DeLorean and ran $50 million per year from an executive boardroom with computers. 2019, 2 duffel bags, a halfway house door closing behind him. Maurice King stepped back into Baltimore, 65 years old, with none of the things that the man who drove a DeLorean through East Baltimore had accumulated. No diamonds, no furs, no boardroom, no jungle mist, no DeLorean, just 2 bags and the specific dignity of a man who has paid for what he built. 37 years. He had gone in when Ronald Reagan was president. He came out when Donald Trump was president. The world that existed when he was arrested had been replaced by a world he had watched through a prison television for nearly 4 decades. Across Baltimore, people recognized him. On Instagram, people flashed greetings when they saw he was home. Donald Carter spotted him on North Avenue and came over, because Baltimore never forgot. Baltimore does not forget the men who shaped it, not the politicians, not the athletes, not the musicians, and not the Kingpins. He appeared as a featured guest at a charity rap concert at the Petapsco Arena. The man who built the most sophisticated drug operation in Baltimore history was invited to speak at a charity event. He does unity engagement walks now through the same neighborhoods he once controlled, past the same corners where his product once moved, talking to young men who are standing where he once stood, making the same calculations he once made about what the legitimate economy was offering versus what the underground economy was generating. His message is direct, without sentimentality, without the kind of romanticization that ex-drug lords sometimes use to make their stories sound more heroic than they were. He says, "Don't let me be your future," not "I regret nothing," not "the system was against us and we did what we had to do." Don't let me be your future. The man who drove a DeLorean through East Baltimore while running $50 million a year, telling the young men on those same corners the truth about where that road ends. 2 duffel bags at 65, halfway house, the same streets, the same corners, different message, $900 million. That is what Baltimore's heroin market was worth annually when Peanut King ran it. 3 times what the city spent on its schools. 3 times. The same children who were being failed by an underfunded school system, who were looking at a legitimate economy that offered them nothing visible, were growing up in neighborhoods where the most successful man they could see was driving a DeLorean and wearing diamond rings and buying women $1,800 silk dresses in Beverly Hills. That is not a defense of what Peanut King built. It is an explanation of why someone builds it. Maurice King looked at East Baltimore and saw a market, an organizational challenge, a supply and demand problem that he was uniquely positioned to solve, at a quality level nobody else was matching, with an infrastructure nobody else was building, with the specific organizational genius that federal prosecutors would eventually describe in court documents that read more like business case studies than criminal indictments. He built something extraordinary. He also built something that fed addiction across the East Coast. That brought heroin into 20,000 Marylanders' lives. That contributed to the deterioration of the neighborhoods he grew up in. Both things are true simultaneously, and the federal judge who sentenced him to 50 years understood exactly what he was sentencing. You were dealing in human misery. 7 words, carried for 40 years by the real Avon Barksdale, the man The Wire was built on, the man who drove a DeLorean through Baltimore while supplying the whole city. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. Philadelphia, the 1980s. The Italian mob is collecting. Every operator in South Philadelphia is paying tribute. Not a request, not a negotiation. The specific reality of how organized crime works in a city divided along Broad Street for decades. East of Broad, the Italians. West of Broad, everybody else. And everybody else pays. Nicky Scarfo is running the Philadelphia crime family with a violence so extreme that even his own men sleep with one eye open. Men are disappearing. Bodies are turning up. The message is delivered once. You pay or you disappear. Every major black operator in Philadelphia is falling in line, except one. One man is not paying tribute. One man is not asking for permission. One man is sitting at the Italian mob's private parties in Atlantic City, not as a subordinate, not as someone who owes them anything, as a peer, as a guest they invited, as the one black man in Philadelphia that the most feared organized crime family on the East Coast had decided was different from everyone else. They called him to their table. They poured him champagne. They did business with him as an equal. And while every other black operator in Philadelphia was paying the mob to survive, this man was having dinner with the men they were paying. His name was Tracy Mason, and this is the story of how a boy from South Philadelphia who had nothing became the one man the Italian mob respected. Tracy Mason grew up in South Philadelphia. His mother died when he was 12 years old. His father was gone shortly after. No safety net, no fallback. Just a young man in one of America's toughest cities with nothing but the streets around him and the intelligence to understand what those streets were trying to teach him. Most boys in his position got consumed. Tracy Mason got educated. His grandmother ran numbers operations, multiple houses running simultaneously through the specific underground economy of South Philadelphia. The gambling infrastructure had been generating money in black Philadelphia neighborhoods since before Tracy was born. He watched how it worked, how money moved, how disputes were handled, how a woman with no formal business training managed a cash enterprise that the entire neighborhood depended on. His uncle was connected to the original Philadelphia Black Mafia, the organization that had controlled the city's underground economy through the 1970s. The men who had answered to the streets before the streets belonged to anyone else. Tracy was absorbing all of it, not as a participant, as a student, learning how organizations functioned, how supply chains worked, how trust was built between men who had every reason not to trust each other, how the specific hierarchy of Philadelphia's underground world maintained itself without contracts, without legal protections, without any of the structures that legitimate businesses use to govern relationships. He was being educated in the one school South. Philadelphia had always been good at running. And then his uncle made a connection to New York. Frank Lucas, the Harlem Kingpin, whose operation had supplied New York at a scale that made him one of the most significant figures in American criminal history. The man who had gone directly to Southeast Asia for his supply, cutting out every middleman, and built an operation so sophisticated that the federal government spent years trying to understand how it worked. His uncle had a relationship with Lucas's organization. Tracy Mason was making trips to New York City, coming back to Philadelphia with supply. A teenager, a supply chain, the specific organizational intelligence of a young man who had been watching how the game worked since before most people his age knew the game existed. He was learning from the absolute top, and he was going to apply everything he learned to Philadelphia. South Philadelphia High School changed everything. In the specific geography of South Philly, that school brought together Black and Italian students from neighborhoods that ran parallel to each other without ever really intersecting. Boys who would grow up on opposite sides of Broad Street, spending 4 years in the same hallways, eating in the same cafeteria, playing on the same teams. Tracy Mason built relationships across that divide. Not superficial relationships, real ones. The kind where Italian families from South Philly invited him to their homes for Sunday dinner, where he sat at their tables and was treated like family, where the specific trust that takes years to build between people from different worlds was established through proximity, through loyalty, through the specific qualities that Tracy Mason had, the intelligence, the discretion, the specific character of a man who understood that you protect the people who let you in. He was not just a Black man who knew some Italians. He was a man that both worlds claimed. A Black kid from west of Broad who Italian families brought to their dinner tables. That had never happened before in South Philadelphia, and it would never happen again in quite the same way. That specific position, trusted on both sides of the most important cultural boundary in the city, would eventually become worth more than any supply chain, any organization, any amount of money he could have built without it. Because in Philadelphia, who you knew was everything. And Tracy Mason knew everyone. He went to Cheney University, one of America's historically Black universities, a Pennsylvania institution that had been educating Black students since before the Civil War, the kind of school that Philadelphia's Black community sent its most promising young people to, the ones who had a future, the ones who could build something legitimate, the ones who the neighborhood was counting on to make it. College didn't hold him. He dropped out. He went to Atlantic City, not as a gambler, as a craps dealer. In the early 1980s, Atlantic City's casino economy was generating money at a scale that New Jersey had never seen. The legalization of gambling had created an entire infrastructure of hospitality and entertainment that moved millions of dollars daily. The hotels, the restaurants, the private rooms, the specific social world of a city that had reinvented itself around money. A craps dealer made approximately $50,000 annually. Legitimate money, good money, the kind of income that most men from his part of South Philadelphia could not access through legitimate work. Tracy Mason took the job, but Tracy Mon was not at that casino to deal craps. He was there to be positioned, to move through the specific social world of Atlantic City in the early 1980s, the casino world, the hospitality world, the world of money and power and private rooms where the real conversations happened. Because the people who mattered in Atlantic City were never on the casino floor. They were in the rooms that did not appear on any hotel map. And the relationships Tracy Mason had built at South Philadelphia High School were about to open every single one of those doors. Atlantic City, a private room in a casino that the public never sees. This is where it happened. The Philadelphia mob had significant presence in Atlantic City. The specific, plausible deniability of casino floors and hotel suites that allowed powerful men to gather without gathering officially. Politicians, businessmen, organized crime figures, all in the same city at the same time for the same stated reason. They were just there to gamble. Nobody was just there to gamble. Nicky Scarfo was there, the most feared crime boss on the East Coast, a man whose paranoia was so acute and whose willingness to eliminate perceived threats was so total that his own organization lived in quiet terror of him. Under his leadership, the Philadelphia crime family had become something that law enforcement officials described as uniquely dangerous, violent beyond what organized crime typically required, ruthless in a way that even the New York families found excessive. His lieutenants were there, Chucky Merlino, Joey Merlino. The next generation of Philadelphia organized crime, young, ambitious, building toward the kind of power that Scarfo's reign represented. These were not men who invited people to their private gatherings. These were men who eliminated people who asked too many questions about their private gatherings. Tracy Mason walked in, not wandered in, not talked his way past a door. Walked in because they had told him to come, because the boy who had been eating Sunday dinner at Italian families' homes in South Philadelphia since high school had spent years building something that no amount of money could accelerate. Real trust. He sat at their table. He drank their champagne. The 1978 Taittinger collection at $150 a bottle in the early 1980s, a specific detail that tells you everything about what kind of evenings these were. Not nightclub champagne, collector's champagne. The kind that men serve when they want the room to understand what they are. He spent $5,000 a night at these gatherings, while the most feared Italian organized crime figures on the East Coast treated him as a peer. Think about what the other black operators in Philadelphia would have said if they had seen that. The men who were paying tribute to survive, who were navigating the specific anxiety of operating in a city where Nicky Scarfo's organization collected from everyone, if they had known that a black man from South Philly was sitting at Scarfo's private table drinking vintage champagne and doing business as an equal. They would not have believed it. But it was happening. And the foundation under it was not just connections, it was trust built through years of Sunday dinners at Italian families' homes in South Philly, through the specific character of a man who had never violated the confidence of anyone who had let him in, through the one quality that organized crime values above everything else, loyalty. Tracy Mason had demonstrated it consistently for years, and the Philadelphia mob had rewarded it with the one thing they had never given a black man in South Philadelphia's entire history, a seat at the table. He was also building his own table. Philadelphia Motor Accessories, South Philadelphia. Tracy Mason and his partner, Benjamin Simon Goff, opened a high-end car customization shop that installed AMG kits and lambskin seat covers and sold the kind of luxury accessories that the men who were generating money in Philadelphia wanted for their cars. Their clientele included Teddy Pendergrass, one of the most celebrated artists in Philadelphia history. The man whose voice had filled arenas and whose name opened every door in the city. They opened a second location in Germantown. A-Tech, two legitimate businesses running simultaneously, real businesses that served real markets, and also the specific infrastructure that a man with Tracy Mason's philosophy needed to operate properly, because that philosophy was specific, and he stated it directly in his own words. "I'm not a gangster, I'm a businessman." That was not modesty, that was not deflection, That was the precise self-understanding of a man who had watched the difference between the men who built things and the men who simply took things, and had decided which category he belonged in. Gangsters made decisions based on ego, on reputation, on the specific performance of power that the streets demanded. They announced themselves. They wore the organization on their sleeves. Businessmen built infrastructure. They built relationships. They built the kind of legitimate cover that allowed money to move through multiple channels simultaneously without creating the specific visibility that eventually destroyed every flashy operator in Philadelphia's history. Tracy Mason built businesses, and then he co-founded the Junior Black Mafia. Aaron Jones was the street boss, the man who had come up through the original Philly Black Mafia's orbit, who had taken counsel from imprisoned Philly Black Mafia Lieutenant Robert Nudie Mims through prison calls and visits, who had the street credibility and the organizational toughness to demand compliance from every operator in Philadelphia. Tracy Mason brought something different. He brought the Italian mob relationship. He brought the supply chain. He brought the specific business intelligence of a man who had sat across the table from Nicky Scarfo and been treated as an equal. Together they built something Philadelphia had never seen. The Junior Black Mafia moved 200 to 300 kilograms of supply per month. Per month. 50 members, 300 associates, diamond-encrusted JBM rings that announced the organization's existence with the confidence of men who believed what they had built was untouchable. 33 legitimate businesses operating alongside the distribution network. The specific corporate architecture that Tracy Mason had been developing since Philadelphia: motor accessories, real businesses, real revenue, real infrastructure that made the organization something no street gang had ever been. And then the message went out across Philadelphia: get down or lay down. Not a suggestion, not a request, a statement of how business would be conducted from that moment forward. Picture what that looked like on a Philadelphia corner in the mid-1980s. Two men pulling up, JBM rings on their hands, the diamond catching the light. A quiet conversation with the operator who had been running that corner, who had his own supply chain, his own customers, his own operation built over years. The conversation was brief. You work with us, or you stop working. Not a threat delivered with raised voices or weapons drawn. Quieter than that, more certain than that. The specific certainty of men who backed their message with an organization moving 200 to 300 kilograms monthly, with the Italian mob's supply and protection behind them, with 33 legitimate businesses anchoring everything they had built. The operator on that corner had a choice, but he understood what both options actually meant. He got down. Every operator in Philadelphia got down. Because the alternative, the specific consequence of laying down in a city run by an organization that had Nicky Scarfo's blessing, was not something any man who wanted to keep operating chose to test. The Philadelphia Crime Commission documented it themselves in 1989. The Junior Black Mafia was in business with members of the Philadelphia Mafia, including Joey Merlino. The alliance that Tracy Mason had built through South Philadelphia dinners and Atlantic City champagne, the relationship that no other black man in Philadelphia's history had been able to establish across the divide of Broad Street, was now the backbone of the most powerful black criminal organization the city had ever produced. The nightclub scene. He walked into a Philadelphia club one night. Michael Jordan was already inside. Not yet the global icon he would become, but already the NBA's scoring champion. The most electric presence in professional basketball. The specific magnetic force that sports celebrity creates in a room, every eye turning, every conversation pausing, the specific gravity of a man who had become one of the most recognizable faces in America. When Tracy Mason walked in, the women who had been gravitating toward Michael Jordan moved toward Tracy. The hustlers were getting more money than NBA players. That sentence, preserved in Philadelphia's oral history of that era, tells you everything about where Tracy Mason stood in the hierarchy of the city he had built his operation in. More compelling than Michael Jordan in his own prime. Not because of his fame, because of what he had built. Because of the specific gravity that a man carries when he has sat at Nicky Scarfo's table and been treated as a peer. When he has an organization moving 200 to 300 kilograms monthly. When the entire city's supply flows through his network. Michael Jordan had fans. Tracy Mason had Philadelphia. The arrest came the way the most consequential arrests often come. Not through a dramatic federal takedown, not through years of surveillance finally closing around everything. Through an ordinary moment. He was at an apartment, a spot he trusted, dropping off his son and picking up money. He noticed something wrong. A maintenance man entering a nearby unit, someone he had never seen before in a building where everyone was known. Someone whose presence in that specific geography didn't fit the pattern of that building. He had been trained by Frank Lucas's world and the Philadelphia Black Mafia and the Italian mob and 2 decades of operating in the most dangerous city in America to recognize when something didn't fit. His instincts were correct. They moved. After the raid, police announced they had seized $80,000. Tracy Mason laughed, not nervously, not out of bravado, because the actual amount in that apartment was $1.5 million. He knew it. They knew it. The gap between what was announced and what was actually there, that gap tells you everything about the scale of what the JBM had built. And the laugh tells you everything about where Tracy Mason stood in relation to it. A man who laughs at an $80,000 seizure announcement because the real number was $1.5 million. That is not a man who is afraid. That is a man whose sense of scale has been permanently altered by what he built. He was charged. He served 7 years. He was released in 1994. While Tracy Mason served his 7 years, the world he had built collapsed around him. Aaron Jones received a life sentence. The JBM's diamond rings ended up in evidence rooms. The 33 legitimate businesses were seized or shuttered. The Italian mob connection that Tracy Mason had cultivated through years of South Philadelphia dinners and Atlantic City parties, the alliance that had given the JBM its supply and its protection and its specific position as the most powerful black organization in Philadelphia history, became exhibit material in Pennsylvania, crime commission reports, and federal prosecutions. And the men across that table, Nicky Scarfo, the most feared crime boss on the East Coast, received 55 years. Joey Merlino eventually faced his own federal racketeering charges. The entire structure, Italian and black, east of Broad and west of Broad, came apart in the federal prosecutions of the late 1980s and early 1990s. And Tracy Mason served 7 years, the shortest sentence of any significant figure from that entire era. He walked out in 1994 while Aaron Jones was settling into what would be the rest of his life in federal prison. He walked out while Nicky Scarfo was 40-something years into his 55-year sentence. He walked out while the diamond JBM rings sat in evidence rooms and the 33 businesses were shuttered and the organization that had made Philadelphia fall in line with a simple message, get down or lay down, was gone. 7 years. He is a car broker now, the man who opened Philadelphia Motor Accessories and ATEC, who knew the luxury car market in Philadelphia better than almost anyone alive, who had been building businesses in this city since the early 1980s, still a businessman. The philosophy he had stated from the beginning, "I'm not a gangster, I'm a businessman," turned out to be the most accurate self-description of anyone from that era, and the most strategically correct one, because gangsters got life sentences. Businessmen got 7 years and went home. To his family, to the car business, to the specific Philadelphia that he had helped shape. And that had shaped him from the moment a 12-year-old boy with no mother and no father looked at everything around him and decided to learn instead of to break. The Frank Lucas connection, the South Philadelphia high school dinners, the Atlantic City rooms, the Nicky Scarfo table, 200 to 300 kilograms per month, the JBM, the laugh at the $80,000 seizure, Michael Jordan's moment, 7 years, home, Tracy Mason, the man who supplied all of Philadelphia, and had dinner with the Italian mob.